agency. We are the official repository for state government records in Alabama. But unlike many state archives, we also collect private manuscript materials. So we're also like a special collections library in that way. Any types of records that help us to document the experiences of Alabamians and to tell their story are within our area of work. And we also are home to the State's History Museum on the second floor of this building. So we also have a vast 500,000 objects in our artifact collection, and we work every day to conserve those on behalf of the citizens of Alabama and to use those to interpret our past and share it with the public, both the general public as well as, very importantly, our K-12 audiences. So we are part of the annual pilgrimage to Montgomery for many Alabama fourth graders from around the state, and work with educators in the K-12 area to help improve history education in Alabama classrooms. But we're also a place for the general public to be here, and a place where I hope that you will bring your children and grandchildren when you have an opportunity. The museum is open Monday through Saturday from 8:30 to 4:30, and our research room, if you ever have occasion to do some work just next door to us here, is open from Tuesday to Saturday from 8:30 to 4:30, and just this month we've been able to restore Saturday hours every Saturday for the first time in about a decade. So we're pleased to be able to extend those hours of operation for researchers. Alabama is nearing the end of a 3-year commemoration of our state's bicentennial. In 1819, 44 delegates met in Huntsville to write our state's first constitution, a process that ushered us into the United States as the 22nd state in the Union. And over the last 3 years, Alabamians across our state have engaged in a multifaceted commemoration of that event, not just of the events of 1819, but also the entire expanse of Alabama history, from prehistory and the arrival of humans here all the way up until the recent past. It's been a great multifaceted program of commemoration that's involved academic institutions, state agencies, the general public, festivals large and small across Alabama, and I think we can say it's been a great success. It is certainly unprecedented, to my knowledge, in terms of a state's commemoration of statehood. We stretched that out over 3 years because Alabama became a territory in 1817 and then became a state in December of 1819. So we had lots of opportunities to do some great things like programs such as this one, and it's all going to come to a close coming up in not too far from now, December 14th. I hope you will mark your calendars to be in Montgomery on that Saturday. We've got a day full of terrific events, starting with the parade that morning, the dedication of a new bicentennial park across the street from the Capitol, which will include a major new installation of 16 pieces of public art. These are relief bronze sculptures that depict important moments in Alabama history. That afternoon, we've got a festival going on all afternoon for families, and then it culminates with a terrific A-list concert. It starts at 4 o'clock that afternoon right in front of the Capitol. We cannot name names yet, but they're working on that. We're getting close, but there are going to be some prominent Alabamians whose names you recognize. And then it all wraps up with a big surprise finale that I also can't say too much about. But you're going to want to be here on December 14th. Prior to that, on this Sunday, we will be having the public opening of a special exhibition upstairs, We the People, Alabama's Defining Documents, is an exhibition of all 6 of our state's constitutions and the 1861 Ordinance of Secession. When you talk about commemoration, and the goals of the bicentennial have been to explore our past, talk about where we are as a state today and where we want to go in the future as a people. And to really engage in that type of commemorative work at a deep level, you have to go back to the basics, and it doesn't get any more basic or foundational than Alabama's 6 state constitutions. You're going to have a chance to see those later this morning with a tour from our staff member who curated that exhibition. There's something special about just seeing those original documents themselves, but we've also placed them in a context that helps you to understand the time period in which they were adopted. And I hope that you will leave today with a copy of this catalog, which is available in our museum store, that accompanies the exhibition, really goes into greater detail, and something that I know that this audience in particular will appreciate. We are so glad to have you here today. I want to thank Alan and Mike for putting together a fantastic program, and when they approached us with this idea, we said, yes, absolutely. We want to host it, put it together, and what a great lineup they've put together. Make yourselves at home today. Please ask any of our staff if you need anything. They'll be happy to help you, and we're looking forward to a great day. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Armand DeKeyser. I'm with the Alabama Humanities Foundation. I'm its executive director. And you're wondering, what does the Alabama Humanities Foundation have to do with CLE and what in the world, what is this all about? Well, about a year ago, we were approached by Steve Murray and said, we've got this great idea for a program to help educate the lawyers of the state about Alabama's constitutions, some of the history, the background, a lot of things, but we need some help. And so, Armand, with the Humanities Foundation, would you be interested in helping us with this? So we did. We thought it was a great idea. It fit right into our mission, and our mission is to help support and promote the humanities all across Alabama. The Humanities Foundation is a 25-member board staffed by volunteers from all across Alabama. One of our former board chairs, Jimmy McLemore, is sitting here. Thank you, Jimmy. We appreciate that. And one of the things we do talk about a great deal is philosophy, ethics, and the law, interestingly. A lot of our programs are involved with a lot of history of Alabama, obviously, and what we try to do is to give a well-rounded education overview of so many things that have happened in Alabama. Our programs range from, we teach preschool kids to help them with their reading and help them with their families, to having programs such as this where we have distinguished guests as various justices, the Chief Justice here, a number of judges here. So it's a wide-ranging group of people that we participate with and help work with. We thoroughly enjoy the work we do. We've got a staff of 7 people in Birmingham, but we are a statewide board. We travel all over. We've appeared in every county in the state, which is really pretty good. We are very involved, as Steve was talking about, the bicentennial. And this actually, the funding that we're helping provide with this is part of bicentennial funding. And that we have been very lucky and fortunate for our state legislator, among others, to help us provide this. So while the bicentennial is wearing down, we've still got a lot going on. One of the big programs we have done in the Humanities Foundation is to create a traveling exhibit. It's gone to, by the time December the 14th rolls around, we'll have been to all 67 counties with an exhibit that is really well done. It talks about Alabama's background and history. It's not a history exhibit per se of artifacts and things like that, and it's not just a timeline of what happened on December 14th, 1819 to this day, but it also talks a lot about the culture of Alabama, the people, the places, and the things that made Alabama. And it's not just the 200 years of our history. There's a great deal of history in Alabama that started way before 1819. So we do talk about that a lot. It's been, like I said, every county. We're on our last 4 counties. I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4 counties left to go before December the 14th. So I thank you for participating. I appreciate your help. I appreciate, Alan, Mike, we appreciate the support and working with you. You've got a distinguished guest list here. Doggone smart people are going to be smart talking to y'all today, really. I'm pretty good. So with that, I thank you for this. I appreciate the opportunity. I'll mingle around. I'll be here a little bit. If you need some help or want to ask me any questions, I'll be here to help answer them. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I'm Chief Justice Tom Parker from the Alabama Supreme Court. I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to particularly thank my colleague, former Chief Justice Dixon from Indiana, for being here. It's good to see you this morning. Now, the Alabama judicial system was created 200 years ago with the 1819 Constitution, but the Alabama Supreme Court did not meet first until 1820. So we will be commemorating the 200th anniversary of the Supreme Court next year. And I want to take just a moment and focus on how political currents at play in our nation have affected the judiciary. During the colonial era, judges were appointed by the Crown. And at the Constitutional Convention, that was continued with judges being appointed for life or good behavior. In 1819, when we created the Constitution of the state of Alabama, that practice was continued here as well. But then came the political current of Jacksonian democracy, and that radically affected the judiciary in Alabama. During the life of that first Constitution of Alabama, it was amended 3 times. 2 of those amendments focused on changing the appointment of judges for life. They were changed to a set term, and then they changed the circuit judges being elected. Now, I have to say it wasn't until the Constitution of 1867 that the election of Supreme Court justices was incorporated into the Constitution. But those political currents at play in the nation had an effect on my branch of government, and I expect as we hear presentations throughout the day, we will hear how other political currents also affected our succession of constitutions. So I look forward to hearing our speakers today and getting into that as I'm going to participate with you in this symposium. Thank you.
Good morning. Dr. Reiser, could I ask you to go ahead and come on up? We're take the panel. We're going to go straight into our 9 o'clock session now, and feel free to just take any spot on the panel, and I'll probably join you at one of these seats as well.
I think that's me. How embarrassing.
Okay, is this on? Yes, it's on. Well, it's great to see so many friends out here. My name is Alan Mendenhall. I'm an Associate Dean at Faulkner University Thomas Goode Jones School of Law, Executive Director of the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty. And I did not intend to speak today. My intention was to just introduce our speakers. Unfortunately, Dr. Bill Stewart is suffering from a sudden illness and is unable to be here. For those of you who know Dr. Stewart or know of Dr. Stewart, he has been a tireless educator for generations and has really been the foremost expert in our history, government, and politics. And so it is unfortunate that he cannot be here today, but our prayers go out to him as he fights this illness. St. George Tucker was a Virginia lawyer, a law professor, a poet, a judge, and a writer who lived from 1752 to 1827. He edited a 5-volume edition of Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law of England, and he had this to say in an 1802 essay called On the Study of Law. And you'll have to bear with me, this is a long block quote here. If an acquaintance with the Constitution and laws of our country be requisite to preserve the blessings of freedom to the people, it necessarily follows that those who are to frame laws or administer the government should possess a thorough knowledge of these subjects. For what can be more absurd than that a person wholly ignorant of the Constitution should presume to make laws pursuant thereto? Or that one who neither understands the Constitution nor the law should boldly adventure to administer the government? Yet such instances occur not unfrequently in all countries, and the danger that they will frequently occur in this is perhaps greater than in any other. The road to office in most other countries is filled with 1,000 turnpikes, which are rarely open but to the rich and powerful. These possess at least the means of education and information. With us, it is equally open to all, but men of talents and virtue are not always the foremost in the course. He goes on to suggest that those who seek political office without a proper civic education are, quote, infinitely more liable to abuse than if their minds had been properly enlightened by study and application. So St. George Tucker is concerned that leaders in his era lacked a proper understanding of our governing institutions remains relevant today. In fact, a principled knowledge of civics and their underpinning philosophical commitments has never been more urgent. Young people increasingly shout down the views of their opponents, unwilling or unable to engage in sustained debate. And we must ensure that future generations understand the legal, philosophical, and constitutional principles that influence the documents that govern both our state and our country. Concepts like rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, consent of the governed, individual rights, ordered liberty, and federalism. An ancient Athenian citizen devoted to a city-state, knowledgeable of its myths, traditions, institutions, politics, and government, prided himself on the civic learning that made his participation in society all the more meaningful and constructive to his family, his friends, his neighbors, and his community. By contrast, according to one survey, only 1 in 3 citizens in the United States can pass a basic citizenship test, as in the type of test we administer to people who have immigrated here and seek to be citizens. Only 1 in 3 native-born Americans can actually pass that test. Justice Neil Gorsuch of the United States Supreme Court recently stated, "I just don't know how a government of and by the people can be sustained if we do not understand its basic structures, what powers we have granted the government, and which ones we have reserved, and who does and doesn't possess the constitutional authority to make new laws to govern us, to execute those laws, and to judge us under them. What happens to democratic accountability, civic responsibility, and so much more when we lose sight of those things and the reasons for them?" Justice Gorsuch may as well have been echoing St. George Tucker. If he's right that it falls on each of us to do what we can to preserve and pass down civic understanding and the virtues of civility, then the work we're doing this morning in this auditorium is important. Justice Gorsuch emphasizes here the importance of understanding A, the structures and operations of our governing institutions, B, the philosophical reasons for these structures and operations, and C, the need to debate ideas civilly and in good faith. Civics education involves much more than simply reading the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, learning which politicians represent which districts, which offices play which roles in government, and so forth. It involves more fundamentally philosophical and historical knowledge. Our state legislature recently enacted Section 164010 of the Alabama Code, which reads, beginning in the 2018-2019 school year, as a required component for completing the government course required in the high school course of study, a student shall correctly answer at least 60 of the 100 questions listed on the civics test, which shall be made available in multiple choice format. The civics test shall be completed as part of a required course in government. The school shall document on the transcript of the student that he or she has successfully completed the civics test as required by this section. So the apparent need for civics education in our state, region, and country catalyzed not only this statute, but also the creation of the Blackstone and Burke Center, which I direct. The center was created in August of 2016 to promote the principles of the common law tradition and American constitutionalism by coordinating educational programs, such as this one, research initiatives, and judicial conferences that examine the norms and nurture the institutions of ordered liberty. So to that end, we host seminars for judges. We operate a Sir Edward Cook Fellowship program for law students. I have 7 Sir Edward Cook Fellows now, and we offer educational programming in civics. For example, this one, we've partnered with the Alabama Supreme Court. We've worked with archives now, and we're beginning to establish relationships with many other organizations throughout the state. But we're here this morning to discuss a particular topic, the Alabama Constitution, and I'll say a few prefatory remarks about it. Just to introduce the Alabama Constitution for those who aren't familiar, and I see a lot of people in here who are very familiar with it already, but it's the longest operative constitution, not just in our country, but in the world. At least nobody has been able to point to one that is longer. It's got well over 900 amendments. By my count, we're up to 946. That could be wrong. I know I'm being recorded, so this is, I could be just disproven later. But most of these involve local rules and regulations of counties and cities because of the restrictions on home rule. The longest national constitution in the world is India's, and it's not even a third of the length of Alabama's. We're on our 6th iteration of the Constitution, and each of the 6 constitutions was founded through a state convention. So the first one was 1819 when the Alabama Territory became a state. There was the 1861 so-called Secession Constitution, the 1865 so-called Reconstruction Constitution, a revised iteration of the Reconstruction Constitution in 1868, in 1875 a constitution marking the end of Reconstruction, and this is a moment when the Alabama Democrats had seized control of the state government and sought to undo what the Republicans had done during the era of Reconstruction. And then we have the 1901 Constitution, which is our current Constitution. And in that year, the Alabama legislature approved a statewide referendum calling for a constitutional convention that would consist of 155 delegates, none of whom were African American. It's indisputably the case, and it must be openly acknowledged and discussed, that the 1901 Constitution was created in part to establish white supremacy and disenfranchise black voters. This is not a term that I used to superimpose on a past event, but it was actually the term used at the convention to describe a goal of the Constitution. So to that end, the Constitution established literacy tests and property and employment requirements as prerequisites for voting. These, of course, were invalidated by the Voting Rights Act. It instituted a poll tax, also invalidated by the Voting Rights Act. It prohibited interracial marriage, invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia. And that language was actually eventually removed by a constitutional amendment in 2000. It required racially segregated public schools, which of course invalidated by Brown v. Board of Education. But there are other features of the Constitution as well. I mentioned earlier that the Constitution limits home rule. Well, what is home rule? Well, that means that the Constitution restricts the power of local government, counties, and cities and towns to pass laws governing their local communities. So these entities have to work with and through the legislature here in Montgomery to achieve their desired goals in many cases. Our Constitution features provisions on taxation, which is unusual. Most states do that by code. Article 1 of the Alabama Constitution contains a Declaration of Rights with 36 sections. And if you read these, you'll find that our Constitution respects and protects fundamental freedoms and personal liberty in language that is more expansive than that of our federal Bill of Rights. So our Constitution is a very complex document with a storied history, a very complex history, and here to explain a dimension of that history is Dr. R. Volney Reiser. Dr. Reiser, Rob Reiser, joined the faculty of the University of West Alabama in 2005. He served as chair of the history department from 2008 to 2014. From 2012 to 2017, he was editor-in-chief of the Alabama Review, which is the journal of record for the Alabama Historical Association. For 2017 and 18, he was the director of the University of West Alabama program in Ireland. Do you accept? Is that something that I could do? That would be great. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm going to find a way to join you on that one. In addition to his books, he's published articles and reviews in a broad range of academic journals and research volumes. He's a specialist in U.S. legal and constitutional history, African American history, and the history of the American South, and is completing 2 monographs: The Litigious Mr. Washington, Booker T. Washington's Legal Battle Against Jim Crow, which is actually under contract with the University of Georgia Press. Has that come out yet, or is that still in?
I think it's like 5 years past due at this point. So
Okay.
Before I am in the grave.
Okay. Well, now we have you on record. I think that's a contract that you just signed. Yeah. And Defending Disfranchisement, Politics, Anti-Democracy, and Jim Crow Constitutionalism, 1890 to 1915. Dr. Reiser is a cum laude graduate of Florida State University and completed his graduate training at the University of Alabama. His dissertation was one of 3 honored as a College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Dissertation for 2005, and in 2006, he was further honored as the sole winner of the university's Outstanding Dissertation Award for 2005. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Reiser.
Thank you, Alan. That's very thorough. I don't know where you got that, but that's very, very thorough introduction. So when I got the invitation for this, you accept the invitation. You don't know what anyone else is going to speak about. And I've spoken here before about voting rights activists fighting the 1901 Constitution. I think I've spoken about that at a CLE event at the State Bar meeting as well. And I've spoken here about judges and legal personalities and why, reinvent the wheel. And I'll just talk about the project I'm finishing first. And it's the second of the 2 books that Alan mentioned there, 2 monograph projects. And its title keeps changing. And at this point, I just tell people there is a book. I think it's pretty interesting, some of the things I have read. We will find out what that book is about when I have finished writing said book. But one of the key features of the book is what I'm looking at is just generally, loosely speaking, and again, this is subject to change given the direction of the wind and rainfall amounts. But right now, I'm saying it's about constitutional culture and political culture and how the 2 meld in Alabama between 1890 and 1915, primarily Alabama. I'll look at the entire region. One of the things that I keep coming back to, and I've bumped up against this before in my previous work with the voting rights activists from 1902, 1903, it is the 1902 registration canvass. And it's not the literal canvas itself, it's not simply just the literal canvas itself. It's also fears that are expressed publicly during the Constitutional Convention, during the lead up to the convention, during the ratification campaign, and then things that are being discussed openly among the political class and what we know of the rank and file voter, what public expressions survive of that, and its reactions to it. So also, because I figured we'd be recorded today, I made prepared remarks, which, I talk to groups of people for a living, but I rarely speak from prepared remarks. So this could be really great, or we could go off the rails. But I think this will keep the likes and to a minimum, if nothing else. Okay, so once upon a time, in 1997, in fact, to explain my entire career. So I was working as a bureaucrat in state government in Tallahassee. I filed UCC documents for a living. So if any of you in your legal practice fill out your UCC financing statements, I'm the guy once upon a time who used to, what's happened? I have broken the microphone rules. Are we good? Okay, all right, I'll get closer to it. So once upon a time, I filed those UCC 1 and UCC 3 documents for a living, and you can imagine just how delightful that was day in and day out. So I decided I would go to graduate school. I didn't intend to be a college professor. I just wanted to go to graduate school. It sounded like a lot more fun than my job filing UCC 1 and 3 financing statements. So I'm seeing there's an So I'm thinking about, as I'm preparing to apply for grad school, I've re-enrolled in some night classes there at Florida State. And so I'm a little older than your normal college student. So I don't want this to come off as I was an exceptionally precocious college senior. I had graduated college before. I'm a grown person. I have to pay my own bills. So I'm a little more on the ball than normal college students. So I go to my professor, her name's Maxine Jones. Some of you may have known her. She does work on Alabama history also. And Maxine was talking one day in class about disfranchisement, and I said, Maxine, Dr. Jones, how did the South get away with what they were doing? And she said, well, you're the one going to graduate school. Why don't you visit the library and find out? So I go to the library. I had never studied Southern history at all. I had had very few courses in U.S. history. And by random chance, the first book that I pulled off the shelf was Van Woodward, 1951, Origins of the New South. And that literally was my text. And so what year is this? 2019? 22 years later. All right. I'm still picking at scabs and pulling at loose threads about the disfranchisement era. I think probably because of my time in a state agency and watching from a certain remove a state legislature and friends who worked in the legislature or as legislative staffers and lobbyists, I think that's probably why I have a natural affinity for really boring process stuff. And this is definitely process stuff, but the thing that I always remind students and when I talk to other people about it is as dull as process stuff is, as dull as UCC statements can be, the devil is actually in the details, right? When we look at a law, when we look at a constitution specifically, I think sometimes we assume that everything is a matter of course and it's a matter of fact and these things are self-executing, to use a phrase that came up a lot during the disfranchisement era, as one southern state after another is looking to create some mechanism that would self-execute the thing that they wanted. And the thing that they wanted, it's not correct to say they wanted an all-white electorate. They did. What they want is a specific type of all-white electorate. And they're grasping at straws, looking for that self-executing magical device. They never found it, right? When we look at the disfranchisement era, we think about sort of the options and the tools that were given, and those are the things we focus on, and I'll mention them again here in a second. But the literacy test, the property qualification, the understanding clause, the grandfather clause in some states, the descendants clause as they called it in Alabama, those things required actual human beings to make judgment calls. And in fact, there were very few guaranteed outcomes. They were presumed outcomes, they were intended outcomes, but everything in that suffrage article, the infamous suffrage article, it still required the practical application from a particular group of men, and that's who we're going to talk about today. And to make it, again, to reiterate, they make everything possible, they make it probable, but there is still a way for the whole project to fall apart. The new Constitution was unpopular, it was risky, and it depends entirely upon the registrars. And understand that the registrars that I'm speaking of, these are not registrars that met after 1902. I'm speaking about a specific group of registrars that meet throughout 1902. The boards of registrars continue to exist. They still exist, but it's a ministerial thing now, but it's not a ministerial thing in 1902. So we're talking about, this is literally 6 months' work is what we care about here. And we care so much about the work that those men did in those 6 months because the work that they do in that 6-month period will have a durable, lasting impact upon state government and elections for the next 6 decades, give or take. Right. So everything is very unpopular. It's very dangerous. Registrars are, the concept of registrars, just in an abstract sense, they're a relatively new thing. As applied to the early 20th century. The idea of advanced voter registration or an election registrar, these are part of the innovations that are introduced into American politics in the late 19th century. And as innocent as some of these things may seem, look, anything can be put to ill purpose, truth be told. Other similar reform measures, you have Australian ballots, you have voice ballots. Secret ballots. But voice votes, when they give way to secret ballots, that means everything is conducted in secret, so there's still a way to abuse it. An Australian ballot requires the advanced preparation and official distribution of a ballot, but if you have advanced preparation and official distribution of a ballot, it doesn't magically clean everything up. It can also just become another tool to mess around or to interfere with the conduct of elections. Advanced voter registration, again, the Board of Registrars, it does regulate polling place conduct, but Just because you've regulated polling place conduct doesn't mean there's only one way you can regulate polling place conduct. These innovations could be, and usually quickly were, throughout the United States, put to ill purpose. So secret ballots, anonymous ballots, those are really easy to destroy or substitute with another secret ballot. Australian ballots, you can do all sorts of things with an Australian ballot. And I think, like, in terms of civic education, students tend to think Australian ballots are secret. They are, but that's not the whole story, right? You could have, like, the infamous South Carolina 8-box law. That can be an Australian ballot, but if you can't read the Australian ballot, that's a good way of how an Australian ballot can be used to abuse voters. And advanced voter registration can be made as inconvenient and onerous as possible. Why do elections officials and politicians in the 19th century like these things? It's because it's a way for them to guarantee the outcome of an election without having to work so hard to persuade a voter. It's, we're not reinventing the wheel here. It's a human tendency. So you eliminate the stress and the expense of arranging election day frauds. There is a lot of talk about purifying elections in the lead up to Alabama's 1901 Constitutional Convention and in the lead up to all the other southern state disfranchising constitutions. But let's be real clear. They're not actually cleaning up elections. They are regulating the fraud, right? So it's not about eliminating the fraud. It's about regulating the fraud and keeping as few people as necessary involved in the fraud, because the frauds have gotten completely out of control. So they're simply going to rein them in or eliminate the need. Let's make sure I have the scare quotes on some of these comments I have to quote today. So by pruning the electorate, by scaring voters away, by reducing the number of people that are going to show up on election day, it means that you have fewer voters on site who have to be persuaded, frightened, bribed, insert, crime here. So you're simply going to, refine the conduct of what happens at the polling place. So you combine in Alabama advanced voter registration with specially selected, and the care, I cannot emphasize enough, the care that went into selecting these registrars. They all have to be partisan zealots, and I'll get to that in a minute. And so you pick the right group of partisan zealots, 3 in each county, and it will allow for mechanically precise disfranchisement of voters in the advanced voter registrations that are conducted from the spring of 1902 through the fall. So, and my point today is that the registrars are the big deal. As offensive, as eye-catching, as sort of, indelible as a poll tax is, or a grandfather clause, or an understanding test, and I don't want it to sound like I'm saying they really weren't that big of a deal. They're a huge deal, but you have to have the registrars, and the reason you have to have the registrars is because there's all sorts of loopholes built into these things. The reason you have the loophole is because if the poll tax is just, the poll right pays the poll tax, but like a literacy test, a property qualification, a good character test, a lot of these things exist for the purpose not of excluding someone per se. The exclusion is going to happen. It's about giving you the leeway to let anybody you want onto the voting rolls. So almost any voter, any adult male, can be allowed onto the voting rolls per the 1901 Constitution. Right? The registrars could have registered to vote under the 1901 Constitution. They could have gotten every black voter in Alabama back onto the voting rolls. Right? They could have. So it's not, that's what I mean by it's not necessarily a self-executing phenomenon. We know why they did it. We know what they wanted to do. I don't want to diminish that, but you have to have humans have to put this thing into effect. So, and the phrase that's used at the time, another phrase that circulates throughout the year 1901, they refer to things being the milk and the coconut. And I like the Eufaula News famously, that's how they describe the registrars. The boards are always the milk and the coconut of the whole thing. An elections registrar could use the tests that are given in the Constitution. They could use those tests for one man and not the next. They could, if they wished, draft 16 separate inconsistent examinations for 16 separate voter registration applicants. They could and were expected to decide for themselves what understanding citizenship meant, and by that I refer to the understanding clauses. And no one could know in a specific administrative sense, what it would mean to understand the privileges and duties of citizenship. They could say you had to understand the privileges and duties of citizenship, but they did not say what it meant. What does it look like to demonstrate that you have proved that you understand those things? As I repeat for my students, and I was lecturing about this a couple of weeks ago, there is a pat apocryphal story that is told during the disfranchisement era, and it gets repeated in historical texts down to the present, and it's a formula joke. And the formula joke is as follows. Unnamed black man shows up at the registration place. Part 2, he asks to register to vote. Part 3, the registrars present a test. Part 4, he makes some worldly observation about how he is not going to pass the test. All right, so that's the formula of the joke. And there's different examples of this, and the one that I typically use for classes is, so Mr. Jim shows up somewhere in Mississippi to register to vote. He shows up, he's admitted to the registrar. The registrar asked him, what does this passage in the Constitution mean? And then the man observes, this passage in the Constitution means that black men aren't voting in Mississippi this year. Right? So that's, and in 1901, white politicians would have told that to make each other laugh because that's what passed for humor. But even if it's formulaic, even if it's apocryphal, I mean, it probably did happen, but we don't know that it happened, but it may well could have. But that's the point, right? It's reflecting the leeway the registrar has because of the loopholes, right? It's because of the loophole, whether it's an understanding test or so on and so forth. And it is concern over how obviously ridiculous the understanding clause is that Louisiana, North Carolina, and then Alabama and Virginia embraced versions of the grandfather clause. The reason Alabama's is about military service as opposed to just your grandfather having voted, it is because of concerns that it was too obvious what they were trying to do. And so every state after Mississippi will make fun of Mississippi, which that's an American tradition. That's why we have Mississippi. But they would always complain that in Mississippi, the cure was worse than the disease, right? So every state's disfranchisers will denounce the understanding clause. They will all then adopt the understanding clause, but they will still denounce it because they think it's just too tacky, right, for a polite society. So you didn't have to be an Alabama resident. You don't have to be a native-born Southerner. You don't have to be a devotee of the democracy, as Democratic partisans referred to the party. It's not because they love small d democracy. They mean the conservative Democratic Party. You don't have to be in the club to understand what's going on. One of the great observations I came across is from the Hartford Daily Current. So this is in the summer of 1901. And the Alabama Convention was just of constant fascination for the national media. Mainly, I think, because there wasn't anything else more exciting happening until the fall with the assassination of McKinley. But from the spring through the early fall, so it's just all Alabama Convention all the time. And as the Hartford Current, when they looked at the Board of Registrars, they were trying to explain, the editor is explaining, what does this board mean? And what it meant, quote, it's whether the unlawful appropriation of a chicken or a ripe watermelon is an infamous crime involving moral turpitude. Now, they're specifically referring to the moral turpitude clause there, but it applies to the whole process writ large. They wanted to eliminate all but a select number of conservative white men, right? That's their goal. Devotees of the Democratic Party, and not just regular, rank and file Democratic devotees. They need predictable ones. They need men who don't get taken in by greenbackers or populists. They do not want Republicans. They do not want anybody who thinks it's fine for black men to vote. They are very picky about who they want to be able to be part of the political process. And you have to have the loophole. They have to have the leeway to make it happen. They have to have it to get the thing ratified. So Alabama's Constitution would be unusual in that it was subject, the entire thing is subject to popular ratification. Mississippi's in 1890 is simply proclaimed into effect. South Carolina's in 1895 is proclaimed into effect. Louisiana's is proclaimed into effect in early 1898. Now, North Carolina, there's a wrinkle. There is an election in North Carolina, but North Carolina didn't rewrite their whole Constitution. It's just a series of proposed amendments to the Constitution. So the North Carolina, the Democratic Party there staged a military coup, right? So to keep the right voters frightened enough. And so they get their amendments ratified and they go into effect in early 99. Alabama will put the whole thing up to a vote. So because you have to put the whole thing up to the vote, that's part of the reason why you have to have these loopholes, because you have to calm white voters down. It's not black voters. It's white voters have to be calmed down. They have to be reassured that this thing is going to happen. The 1901 Constitution is extremely unpopular, right? It is unpopular amongst the public at large. It comes under constant criticism from the state's editorial class. I don't think, we know that enormous frauds are at play in getting the thing ratified. And even with those frauds, the vote was surprisingly close, truth be told. But we know that they were always going to manipulate voting returns in the Black Belt to ensure ratification. All right? So the fix was in, essentially. Still, we have to pay attention to the opposition. And there are lots of reasons people opposed it. They opposed it because of what it does with taxation. They oppose it because what it does with railroad passes. They oppose it for home rule concerns. And they oppose it, poor white men do, because they know that they're about to get screwed. And when you look at the speeches that the ratification speakers have to give, they have to constantly reassure voters, really guys, seriously, chill. You don't have anything to worry about. And so it's all inside jokes and winks and nods and interminable, really strange, when you think about it, legal arguments. And one of my favorite ones to look at, and it's favorite because it's one of the few that were recorded and you can look at them down to the present, came from John Knox, who was the president of the convention. And John Knox had he was a very wealthy and successful lawyer from Anniston. His part-time job is imagining himself in the United States Senate. He never got his seat. But because of that, all of his major addresses in the convention will be printed and published and distributed around the state. Now, he's not the only man who had this done, but he's the president of the convention. So his ratification speech also gets published. And you can find, there are copies of it survive, and it's, It's the speech of the Honorable John Knox of Calhoun County, president of the late convention in Alabama, in closing the campaign in favor of ratification at Centerville in Bibb County, November 9th, 1901. So, what you have to think about, it's not that John Knox is in Bibb County the 2 days before the ratification. I would think that would be a Sunday if the referendum was on the 11th. It's not that interesting that he's in Bibb County. Bibb County would have been a true battleground county during the ratification campaign. What's interesting is that at a speech to the rank and file voters there gathered at the Bibb County courthouse why is he going on and on and on about constitutional interpretation? Why is he talking about a relatively obscure California State Supreme Court case, right? And what you find if you think about it, and if you notice what's being said in other states, and this is what I mean about studying the constitutional culture of it, is ratification campaigners in Alabama, in the Carolinas, not in Mississippi, but in Alabama and the Carolinas in particular, they have to spend an awful lot of time presenting constitutional arguments to a skeptical public. And this isn't a CLE event. He's not lecturing to the law faculty up at the university. He's lecturing to a random group of voters on a Sunday afternoon at the Bibb County Courthouse, right? And they're getting really down into the weeds. And this would happen over and over. You see references to it in the press. These constitutional concerns got so severe in the state of North Carolina that the legislature was brought back into session to amend the proposed amendment, right? To reassure voters, or to let the voters believe that they really didn't need to worry about the United States Supreme Court or Congress getting involved. And that would be the ultimate scary thing to happen, right? Their worst nightmare is the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So just so you know what they're afraid of. When the Democratic Party Executive Committee, and this is headed up by Oscar Underwood, so they published the official campaign pamphlet. that they're presenting to voters. And once again, they have a big special heading for voters, just so you know the registrars are not going to screw you over, because again, the registrars have the power to screw you over or get you onto the rolls. Registrars will observe the party pledge, and the party pledge had been to disfranchise no white men. Right? When, quote, when white men insist upon their rights and will not submit to disfranchisement by any registrar. The registrars know this and will not refuse to register them except for good cause. Besides this, it must be, and this is where you go, what is a good cause? Right? Besides this, it must be presumed that the registrars who will be appointed by high officials in the party that has always stood for white man's supremacy will be in sympathy with the best methods yet devised to secure it. All right, so the registrars, they're really powerful, white voter, but we swear you have nothing to fear. Registrars in that 1902 registration, they operate apart from the legislative and the executive, and the work that they do in practical effect, I don't mean in actual text, and we can talk about that in another context. It's essentially beyond judicial review, effectively, and they're trying to keep it beyond judicial review. No sooner do the polls close on November the 11th than attention turns to the registrars themselves. So the Constitution creates a special board of appointment just for the 1902 registrars, and it's the governor, the agriculture commissioner, and the state auditor. Now, why? Why not the Secretary of State? And I think the reason for that is that the Agriculture Commissioner, Robert Ransom Poole, and the State Auditor, Thomas Sowell, along with Jelks, they are considered to be a far more stable and predictable group in terms of who they will select as registrars. So they have to pick, there's only 66 counties at that time, so they have to very quickly, between November and the canvassing opening in March, they have to get these men appointed. And honestly, one of the things that surprised me about this is that they didn't go into the convention already knowing who the registrars would be, that they're still talking about who the registrars will be. And so letters begin to pour into their offices, and these are men, they're begging to become registrars. And what happens throughout the vetting process is you have to impress Jelk, Sowell, and Poole with your democratic zeal. So you have to offer your personal testimony, like how you came to accept the Democratic Party as your Lord and Savior. And you have to prove it to the congregation. And a good example of this is a man in Tuscaloosa, Francis Purifoy, who writes to Sowell, and this is in the governor's papers, this is where it survives. He promises that, quote, he is not weak-kneed, and he will, quote, perform my duties as intended by the makers of the Constitution to disfranchise no white man. And that thing about weak-kneed, that showed up in other states as well. There are almost, to sort of bypass some of this, there are almost no records of the registrar's work in any state, right? This is on purpose. I think that to be a registrar in 1901, I don't want to say that it was as unsavory as being the hangman at the state penitentiary, but almost to some extent the secrecy that they maintain. Right? You don't have a lot of firsthand reports out of the registration precinct booths. You have a few, but you don't have a lot. And that weak-kneed thing, it's very, very important. And when anecdotal reports of other states' registrars appear, first of all, they're very rare. And they always boast how strong-willed this man is, and he's tough, and he never lets anybody onto the voting rolls who should not be there. And the subtext when they're praising a particular registrar is how tough he is and how he doesn't let anyone onto the voting rolls. Remember, they're telling you that he has the power to let anyone onto the voting rolls. Right? Registrars, those 1902 registrars, they are exceptionally powerful. So if you first of all, the Constitution disfranchised every man in the state of Alabama. So there were you don't get, to make a bad pun about the grandfather clause, you don't get grandfathered into the new Constitution. So if you're registered to vote, in that referendum, you're no longer registered. So every man who intends the vote has to re-register in the spring of 1902. Actually, let me check that. You don't have to register in the spring of 1902, but you want to register in the spring of 1902. Because if you were registered to vote in 1902, you received a very special lifetime voting certificate. Right? That is what you would receive from your county board of registrars, the lifetime voter certificate. You still have to pay your poll taxes every year, and it's a cumulative poll tax. But you wanted that lifetime certificate because the rules changed in 1903. So voting registration gets even more difficult after 1902, as difficult as it is in 1902. So you need to be registered by January the 1st. You would still, have to keep that registration current, but it would be easier to keep it current, apparently, than to start all over again in 1903. So during the ratification campaign, a populist newspaper over in Shelby County, the People's Advocate, which is just an awesome newspaper if you want to do some research, they warn everybody that the registrars are going to have, they quote, the liberties of the people in their hands, and they did. Now, throughout 1902, each county's 3-member board will make a precinct-level canvass. They are required to publicize these things. If you go to county-level newspapers, you will see the advertisements from the County Board of Registrars, and they will tell you, the Winston registrars will be in Beat 3 in Haleyville on X date. And these days are not convenient. Surprise. It's the middle of the week. They will keep odd hours. They're not going to drive around in a wagon by your house and stop in the front yard. They're not going to make it easy, but they will. But they have to advertise it, so they will. You don't, like I said, you don't get many accounts of what's going on, actual sort of desk level accounts. But the registrars are in the newspapers constantly. Number one, they're in the newspapers because people are interested. What are these registrars up to? And I should also add, the registrars are getting paid, so that also, we know how Alabamians feel about paid government officials. So everyone is keeping track of these paid registrars. When the registrars do make public statements, it is always to boast of how few black men were being allowed to register. Right? They don't say we've tried really hard and we can't find any. That's not what they do. It's to boast. It's to assure white men it's safe. It's totally safe. Come on down. As long as you're white, we're going to take care of you. Newspaper editors in particular are deeply concerned that voting registration or that the 1901 Constitution is working a little too well. Right? And so what starts to happen by May or June of 1902 in almost every county that I've looked at, and I've looked at all of them, they're worried too few white men are showing up. And so the registrars will begin making public statements through the newspapers. Please show up and register. It's completely safe. Here in Montgomery, the registrars told the advertiser, quote, "We hope indifferent electors will come forward and attend this important duty. White men have nothing to fear," they insisted, and, quote, "would not be asked any embarrassing questions," right? So they're promising you, we won't ask you if you're poor. We won't ask you if you're illiterate, right? Just come on down. Quote, they are anxious to issue certificates to the white voters of this county. And what I mean by it working a little too well, and again, as I would explain to students, disfranchisement there's 3 parts of this. There's poverty. So they're counting on poverty to keep men from trying to register in the first place. There's shame, and shame would be you're being asked an embarrassing question. So you don't want to show up at the polling place and say, I would like to register to vote, but I have no property, I can't pay my property. No, you're not going to do that. So poverty gets you there. You have loopholes. You have an understanding clause. You have the good character test. You can have the character affidavits. You could claim the descendants clause. But you can't claim those loopholes unless you have first said, I am poor and ignorant. So do you want to show up, and probably in little courthouse auditoriums about this size maybe, you've got a group of your friends and neighbors who you've known forever, guys you go to church with. Your 3 registrars are sitting up here across the front of the room. Do you want to come to the podium and go, Dear Registrar, I am poor and ignorant. Please let me through the restrictions because my grandfather was in the Army. Do you really want to do that? And one other thing about how we focus on the descendants clause and the grandfather clause, and it is the most notorious of all the things the southern states cooked up during this day and time. Louisiana is interesting because in Louisiana, they turned it into the really cool way to register. Louisiana kept records of it. And one of the interesting things they did there is they got all of the wealthiest and the most prominent jurists and lawyers and Democratic jurists and Democratic politicians in Louisiana. They all made a big show of saying that they had registered through the grandfather clause, right? And you have to, again, why would they make a show of it? And you make a show of it because you're trying to encourage men not to be afraid to use the thing in the first place. But poverty and shame are going to do most of the work of disfranchisement, almost all of it. I I think when we look at the aftermath, we know that 98% of African American men are disfranchised. We know that upwards of 30 or 40% of white men are disfranchised. I'm willing to bet that very few of those men actually showed up. And that gets us to the third thing, and it's here. It's the Board of Registrars. It's only if you are willing to actively fight it are you ever probably going to be turned down in person, right? And that's about the only way you have to worry about being embarrassed at the Board of Registrars. I've emphasized many times that we don't really know anything about what happened in the room, and we don't, because you cannot go down the hall and fill out a call slip and have someone bring you the records on a cart. You can get the registration book, the Book of Life, as I sometimes call it, people who got inscribed in 1902. You can get that, but you will not get records of how many people applied and how many people are rejected. You won't get those. And that's not an accident. That's not poor record keeping. You don't need records. There's no incentive to keep a full record of everything that you have done. All of this is a very long route around the mountain for me to tell you we do know a little. And we know a little because at least 2 newspaper editors got onto boards of registrars. One of them, his name's Thomas Shropshire. He's over in Cherokee County. And the other was a man named B.J. Cowart up in, what county is B.J.? Is he Walker or is he Winston? I'm sorry. Yeah, he's Winston. He's at the Double Springs New Era. And Shropshire and Walker, for historians, or Cowart rather, they very helpfully keep records of what they were doing. And I can tell you that Shropshire is chattier than Cowart. But Cowart, he bears out everything that Shropshire said. Also, Shropshire has that really cool name, so you can turn it into a tongue twister. You can say it over and over again. He and his brother, they have this campaign. They're writing, asking for the appointment. They introduce themselves as, we are the Shropshire brothers. You know, it's kind of a stage act, I guess. Shropshire, like I said, he's the one that keeps the best records of what he and his brother registrars were doing. And as the registrars in Cherokee County, they make their progress around through all the beats, he will have little updates, not long discursive columns, but he is the editor and he has to fill his page space. And so he'll fill it with his own work. We know, for example, one in April 11th of 2002, he announces to his readers that they had registered, he and the other 2 guys, they've registered 1,710 voters. And what he always wants to emphasize is how few of them are black. Quote, as he describes it, he goes, only 20 of whom were sons of Ham. A week later, he tells them that they've registered some black voters in Cherokee County, but he wants everyone to know it's only 25 out of 2,100. And I should tell you that the registration books don't list the race either, right? So the only way you're going to get a firm figure is from someone like Shropshire. As of the 25th, he assures his readers they've only registered 27 African-American voters out of 2,800 countywide. Walker County, now I'm doubting myself. What county is Double Springs in? Because here I've said Walker, but I think it's Winston. We'll figure that out. Cowart doesn't give the level of detail that Shropshire did, but what Cowart does is he will pick up reports from other counties and he'll just simply rubber stamp them. And what gets him really excited is when in Walker County, the Jasper Mountain Eagle boasts to its readers that there are no black voters registered in Walker County. And Cowart, he announces, "What Winston sends you news, little sister." All right, so, and you see the same thing over and over again. There is glee. Now, whether it's Shropshire and Cowart gleefully talking about how few or how none African-American men have been registered to vote, the same thing is borne out when you look at any other official pronouncement from a state government official, from a state party leader, or from a Democratic-leaning newspaper editor. It is always to emphasize to white voters the registrars are not as scary as you think they are. And all of that, again, I would say it just emphasizes, I don't want to say a contingency because we know what was going to happen. But it's important, I think, to understand, to circle back to the question of like boring process stuff and how the devil is in the details. Some group of people had to constantly, repeatedly make an active choice to do this thing, right? They didn't just draft the Constitution and step away and just let the magic happen, right? You always have to have people involved in this, right? And so, and I think it's important not to absolve everybody of their hand in this. So a lot of people had a hand in this, and they had to make it happen over and over again. The tests, again, that's what we focus on. That's what my students get all excited about. That's what I was excited about in 1997 when I asked Maxine, how did the South get away with this thing? I wanted to study literacy tests and understanding clauses and grandfather clauses, and people, I have. But it's always that boring, anonymous functionary with a stamp, who has to file the actual documents. They're the ones who have to make the thing happen. Registrars could exclude a voter for poor character. The registrars could admit a man because he understood the privileges and duties of citizenship. They could decide that petty theft was or was not a matter of moral turpitude. They could, or they had, a great number of coulds at their disposal. The Constitution gave them a great many shalls, and there's a great many deceptive silences, all of which is to say, or to repeat for like the umpteenth time today, it's all about giving the registrars the power to make this thing happen. And the reason that it matters that we understand that it requires a group of registrars over and over and over again making the decision to keep this thing going, it's because, again, it's the role of historical contingency. And it's also a matter of understanding, again, to use that phrase, self-executing. The 1901 Constitution and its provisions, they're firm, they're fixed. We can read them, we can point to them, we can read all 986 amendments, but at every step they require human actors to put these things into place. And I will shut up now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reiser, for the remarks, not for the shutting up.
No. Well, I mean,
we have roughly 5 minutes, which means we'll probably at most get 2 questions, but if anyone has a question for Dr. Reiser, we have about 5 minutes for that. Yes, Sam McClure.
You mentioned one of the newspaper editorials that only 20 African Americans were admitted to the voting rolls. How was it that those 20 African Americans were admitted to the rolls?
they would have been, so we have, I said we don't have state generated records for what it looked like inside the room. So there is one, we have, for example, we know that, say, in Macon County, the Macon County registrars, like their first order of business is like, guys, stop what you're doing. We have got to get Mr. Washington registered, right? So they're desperate to make sure he's the first, so they can advertise if they've registered him, for example. We have, in my previous work on fighting disfranchisement, we have the affidavits left by voting registration applicants in the cases here out of Montgomery, the Giles cases that Wilford Smith and Washington engineered. But one really good example of what would have happened, and it's not a matter of telling you what happened in Cherokee County. It's just if you read this account, you get an idea of, good God, what that meant, what the 25 must have gone through. So there is a very obscure autobiography that I'm sure we have copies of here. It's called Inching Along, and it's by Henry Davidson from Centerville. And Henry Davidson was one of almost innumerable, I don't want to say acolytes of Booker T. Washington, but sort of like an acolyte. And he had opened up a school for African Americans in Centerville. In fact, a note here. I attended Centerville Elementary School, which is Henry Davidson's actual school. Davidson wrote in his autobiography about what he went through to get registered to vote in Bibb County. And understand who Davidson is. This is a man who owns property. He's well known. He's well thought of. He's very active politically. He's very civic. There's no question about his literacy or his character or whether he owns property. And when he showed up, the registrars panicked. Right? And what ensues is the desperate attempt on their part to get Henry to go away and, be a good guy and don't fight this. And Henry didn't, and so he pushed it. And what I mean by he actively made them attempt to disfranchise them, and all of those litigants from here in Montgomery, what it means is he kept pushing them. And so they would give him the literacy test, and he would pass it. And they would ask him to interpret the Constitution, and he did. And they demanded that he get good character affidavits. And what happened is any black voter who got that far, what they were expected to do was to go get 3 sworn affidavits from prominent white men of unimpeachable character who would then vouch for their character. And we know that many of them had difficulty finding 3 men who were willing to put their necks on the line to register this black man. So we know that. And so when you ask me what did they have to do or what was it like, I don't have such an account from Cherokee. There's very few of these counts survive. But if you think about what happened in other places, it could have been, somebody who knew somebody. They probably, to some extent, knew that they were better off registering a few than registering none, because then you can always use them, to cover yourself. But that, I don't know if that helps or not.
Follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you know how the disenfranchised, you said 98% of black voters, 30% of white men.
Mm-hmm.
How does that compare to other similarly situated states during that time? Is that more or less disenfranchised?
I don't have the figures in front of me. I've seen them before. It's essentially the same thing happens. And understand, one of the things to also to get here is it's not that everybody was really voting freely up to that point. I don't want to get into the tall weeds of Bourbon coup d'etat and the fait accompli theses and all that kind of stuff. But for a long time, through fraud and manipulation, you had men who were effectively voteless, even if they were still registered to vote, if that makes any sense. So, but you compare the number before and the number after. It is a consistent thing in the South is you find that elected officials are consistently astonished by how well their project worked. Like, example, in Mississippi, they were blown away with how well the whole thing had gone, right? Blown away. Well, by well, I mean, bad for African Americans. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reiser. I think that concludes our time for this panel. We will be meeting back in this room at 10:15 for the next session. So session 1 is now over. Thank you very much.
So I will tell you, this is, I was so, I think my parents moved to County Nashville. We're not really from the county, we were from Gary County. My mom married a man from someplace else. So then he was a Forest Service. He moved to Florida when I was 13. And this is a long-winded way to say, I was aware at about the time we moved forward, I was aware of a little controversy. Everybody was up in arms about the name of the school. I think what had happened, I think it was the Davidson family that asked, because I was at that elementary school. My mom confirmed this recently. I was in a reverse integrated kindergarten. They started at 12. So that would have been 78, 79. And what they had done in the school was it had always been called the Davidson School. It was the black high school. When they integrated it, they put the name, it was called Central Elementary. What was happening in the early 80s was people wanted to call Davidson Elementary because it was and all controversy was there. Oh, right. But I think I did. Long time. See, I don't know who you knew people who knew him. I would have known the Elson sisters. And the Elson sisters, Rhoda and her sister. I knew her sister Connie. I didn't know her daughter. My grandmother was from and I believe, I can't prove it, I think their father is one of David's character David's. And Mr. Ellison would have been untouchable because he was Tennessee Coal and Iron. And I think he was one of David's favorites. I haven't taken interest in things. I get to know such a bird in my personality. But there is surviving on wood. But if God is willing and the creek doesn't rock, by the time I get out there, there is a man there, his name is William Crockett. His grandfather was one of these men who were after Jackson Giles and guys who go. He's in Maui. His name is William Crockett.
Francis Crockett, Wendell Crockett.
Yes.
The office was at, he was on the.
Yeah.
In the Joseph building with, in the Jackson Giles.
Right here,
Houston Street at that point. And he went to the Jackson.
so, well, his grandson is William, his name is William Crockett.
He's still in Hawaii.
He's at 36 Market Street. And so, we'll be 92. So I can't get there until December. But he knew William, but he knew his grandfather. So he's a very and I found in Wendell, he was born here. That's right. They left just months ago. Anyway, so he said, I've got the impression that he's going to tell me things about his grandfather, because there's not a lot. He's the first son I found that really tell me something. So we're going to see what he says about his files here.
William Crockett, and William was son of University of Michigan.
I think he may have attended this
Okay, well, anyway, you get my.
Yeah.
But Wendell lives on the south side of Union Street. Here,
Where the Washington School.
yeah, outside. And all for the same.
Had a newspaper. And it turns out it was one issue.
That's
Well, I've seen pictures of it. What I'm trying to find, the Landmarks Foundation for this, is what I'm hoping to find is these photographs of the State School, because I think the fact that they photographed the State School because they would have lived to the school. I'm still unclear on whether the Washington school site is where their house was. There's some trying to, but I think it's the school.
I have a picture of a swing. All right, right, so I remember I was standing there and I was
expensive.
but the swing. Well, see, that's the whole thing. We have not really placed premium on American history as we should have. See, I preach Crockett in context. He was able to do some things in Hawaii, which William Franklin.
He moves out there in 1900 and by 1903 is the Maui County River. So now I will say this, I've got the one letter from Mr. Knox. It's hard to do research on him. You Google his name, all you get is his ex-wife. And so he's the grandfather and the father. They are a lot
They have wireless. I could sit to one end.
Okay, good. Okay.
So they're wireless.
One side that's a PDF, is that one?
I mean, I was going to stand.
This big button right here. You just speak at it.
Okay, I'm just gotta make sure. Is there anything that pulls out here?
No, do you need place for your
Oh no, it's not. It's just my notes, and if he takes that down, yeah, just as long as I can put it out. So I think he's going first. So is this your guys' laptop or his?
It's out.
Okay. Well, maybe I can just slip it. We'll figure it out.
I'm going to send the rest of it real quick. Yeah.
Where we have 4 kids.